My uncle swapped our grandfather's original painting for a forgery. 10 months after my grandfather died, I stood in front of the painting that had hung over his fireplace for 60 years and knew, within about 4 seconds of looking at it, that it wasn't the same canvas anymore. My grandfather Anselm wasn't a wealthy man for most of his life, but he had one genuine stroke of luck that shaped the back half of it. In his 30s, working as a framer's assistant in a small gallery district, he'd bought a small oil painting from a struggling, then unknown artist named Corvin Delacroix for almost nothing, mostly out of pity and genuine affection for the man's work rather than any real expectation of investment. Delacroix died young, obscure, and largely forgotten, and would likely have stayed that way if a retrospective exhibition 30 years later hadn't rediscovered his work and, over the following decade, turned him into a modestly but genuinely significant figure in the regional art history of that period. The painting my grandfather had bought for the equivalent of a week's wages became, by the time I was in college, worth more than his entire house. He never sold it. People asked him to, more than once, gallery owners and collectors who tracked down his address after the retrospective made his ownership a matter of public record among people who followed such things. He always said the same thing when they asked, that the painting wasn't really an investment to him. It was a friend's memory hanging on his wall, and he wasn't in the business of selling memories no matter what number got attached to them. I grew up under that painting the way some kids grow up under a crucifix or a family portrait, a fixed point in every holiday photo, every ordinary Tuesday dinner, the low, warm autumn light of Delacroix's brushwork presiding quietly over decades of my grandfather's life. My grandfather had 3 children: my mother, her older sister, my Aunt Perpetua, and their brother, my Uncle Roderick. And by the time I was old enough to understand family dynamics clearly, it was obvious that Roderick's relationship with money and with our grandfather's eventual estate carried a specific tension the other 2 siblings' relationships didn't. Roderick had struggled financially for most of his adult life, a string of business ventures that never quite worked out, a divorce that had cost him more than he could comfortably absorb, a general pattern of financial instability that our grandfather, generous by nature, had quietly bailed him out of more than once over the years. I don't say this to condemn Roderick outright. Plenty of people struggle financially without becoming what he eventually became, but I think it matters to understanding what happened, the specific pressure he was carrying that my mother and aunt, both more financially stable, weren't. Our grandfather's will, drafted with a lawyer nearly a decade before he died, divided his estate into 3 roughly equal shares among his children, with one specific, carefully worded exception. The Delacroix painting itself was to remain jointly owned by all 3 siblings, displayed on a rotating basis in each of their homes for agreed periods, never sold without unanimous consent from all 3, a structure our grandfather's attorney later told me he'd insisted on specifically because he understood how differently his children valued the painting. Roderick, understandably given his circumstances, primarily for its financial worth, my mother and aunt, primarily for what it represented of their father's life and taste and quiet, stubborn loyalty to an old friend's memory. Our grandfather died in early winter, peacefully, at home, surrounded by family, the kind of ending that felt, at the time, like at least a small mercy given how much harder the last several years of his declining health had been. The painting stayed where it had always hung, over the fireplace in the house he'd lived in for 60 years, while the 3 siblings worked through the slow, complicated logistics of settling an estate, the house itself, some savings, a scattering of other possessions, and the painting's rotating custody arrangement, which none of them had gotten around to formally activating yet since the house itself hadn't sold, and there'd been no immediate need to move the painting anywhere. I have a specific memory, one I've returned to often since all of this happened, of my grandfather sitting me down in front of that painting when I was maybe 11 years old, tracing his finger just above the canvas surface, careful never to actually touch the paint itself, showing me how Delacroix had built up that particular corner in thick, deliberate layers to capture the exact quality of late afternoon light falling across an old stone wall. He told me that afternoon that a real painting, made by a real hand working carefully over real hours, held a kind of texture and depth that nothing else could ever quite replicate, that even the finest print or reproduction, no matter how technically accurate, would always be flat, in a way the original never was, because a reproduction only captured what the painting looked like, while the original still carried, physically, the actual decisions the artist had made pressing brush to canvas. I didn't fully understand what he meant at 11. I understood it completely, and painfully, a decade later, standing in front of a forgery good enough to fool nearly everyone who looked at it, everyone except the specific, trained instinct my grandfather had spent one particular afternoon trying to plant in me. I visited that house regularly during those first 10 months, partly to help my mother sort through decades of belongings, partly just because I wasn't ready to stop spending time in the rooms where my grandfather had lived his whole life. The painting was always there when I visited, exactly where it had always been, and I never once, walking past it during those early visits, thought to look at it with anything other than the comfortable, unquestioning familiarity you extend to something that's simply always been part of the furniture of your life. It was on a visit in early autumn, nearly 10 months after the funeral, helping my mother finally begin the process of clearing out the house ahead of its eventual sale, that I stopped in front of the painting for a reason I still can't fully explain, some small, nagging discomfort I couldn't immediately name, and actually looked at it closely for the first time in years, rather than simply registering its familiar presence. And once I looked closely, really looked, the discomfort sharpened into something specific and cold. The brushwork along the lower left corner, a section I remembered clearly from childhood because my grandfather had once shown me, with real tenderness, exactly how Delacroix had built up the paint in thick, deliberate layers to capture the particular texture of late afternoon light on a stone wall, looked flatter now, thinner, competent, but somehow lifeless in a way the original had never been. I didn't say anything to my mother that day. I told myself, standing there, that I was imagining things, that a decade of memory could easily distort details this specific, that grief made people see all kinds of things that weren't really there. I went home that evening and pulled up an old family photo on my phone, a Christmas photo from years earlier that happened to have the painting visible in the background, hanging in its usual place. And I spent almost an hour zooming in on that small, low-resolution corner of the image, comparing it against my memory of what I'd just seen in person, unable to fully convince myself either way. I mentioned it finally to my Aunt Perpetua a few days later, carefully, framing it as an uncertain observation rather than an accusation, because even voicing the possibility out loud felt, at the time, faintly absurd. Who would forge a painting hanging in their own father's living room, in a house the whole family still visited regularly? Perpetua listened without dismissing me outright, which I appreciated, and admitted that she too had noticed something feel slightly off about the painting on her last visit, though she'd attributed it, the same way I initially had, to some trick of memory or lighting rather than anything more concerning. She suggested we ask Roderick directly, since he'd been the one, we both remembered now, piecing the timeline together, who'd suggested nearly a year earlier that the painting be professionally cleaned and revarnished, offering to handle arranging it himself since he knew a guy in the restoration business who could do it affordably as a favor. That detail, once we both remembered it clearly, sat uneasily between us on the phone. Neither of us could recall Roderick ever actually confirming the cleaning had happened, or showing either of us any documentation of the work, or mentioning it again after that initial offer months earlier. We'd simply assumed, in the fog of grief and estate logistics, that it had quietly gotten done at some point, the way so many small tasks during that period had simply happened without either of us tracking every detail personally. I called Roderick that same evening, keeping my voice as neutral and unaccusatory as I could manage, and asked him simply whether the painting had ever gone out for the cleaning and restoration he'd mentioned arranging. There was a pause on the line, longer than felt natural, before he answered. He said yes, it had, months earlier, that the restorer he knew had done excellent, careful work, that he was surprised I was even asking, since he assumed everyone had simply noticed and appreciated how much brighter and better preserved the painting looked now compared to before. I told him carefully that it didn't look brighter or better preserved to me. It looked different, in ways that concerned me rather than reassured me. His tone shifted at that, subtly, into something more clipped, a register I'd rarely heard him use with me before. He said restoration work could sometimes look unfamiliar to people who weren't used to seeing a painting properly cleaned after decades of accumulated grime and old varnish, that this was a normal reaction untrained eyes sometimes had, that he was frankly a little offended I was questioning work he'd gone out of his way to arrange as a service to the whole family. He said this in a tone that made me feel, in the moment, genuinely guilty for raising the concern at all, the specific, disorienting guilt of being made to feel unreasonable for noticing something real. I didn't fully back down, though. Not this time. Not after 10 months of a quiet, nagging feeling I could no longer talk myself out of. I asked him directly for the restorer's contact information, said I'd feel better simply confirming with a professional that the current painting was the same physical object as before, just cleaned rather than anything more concerning. Roderick hesitated again, longer this time, and then said he'd have to track down the restorer's information, that it had been a while and he wasn't sure he still had the contact details readily available, that he'd get back to me. He didn't get back to me. Not that week, not the following week, not despite 2 follow-up calls I made. Each one met with a slightly different, increasingly vague excuse. He was busy, he'd misplaced the information, he'd reach out to the restorer directly and relay whatever confirmation I needed, rather than giving me the contact information myself, since apparently the restorer preferred not to be contacted directly by people outside his existing client relationships. By the 3rd week of this pattern, I stopped believing there had ever been a restorer at all. I brought my growing suspicion to my mother directly at that point, since I could no longer justify carrying it alone while still framing it, even to myself, as an uncertain impression rather than something worth real investigation. She was, understandably, deeply reluctant at first to consider the possibility seriously. Roderick was her younger brother, someone she'd protected and worried over and quietly helped for decades, and the idea that he might have secretly swapped out their father's most treasured, most financially significant possession felt, to her, like an accusation too enormous to entertain without overwhelming proof. But she agreed, eventually, that getting a professional opinion on the painting's authenticity couldn't hurt regardless of what we ultimately found, and that not knowing, at this point, felt worse than whatever the answer turned out to be. My mother's friend, the one who worked in museum administration, had described Wilhelmina to us over the phone as someone with with an almost unsettling gift for spotting inconsistencies in regional artwork that even experienced curators sometimes missed. Someone who'd been quietly consulted on several notable authentication disputes over the years, without ever seeking the kind of public credit that might have made her name more widely known outside the specific, insular world of fine art appraisal. She won't tell you what you want to hear, the friend warned us. She'll tell you what the painting is actually telling her. Given what you've described to me, I think that's exactly what you need right now, even if it turns out to be painful. We reached out to that fine art appraiser, Wilhelmina Ose, a careful, precise woman who specialized specifically in early to mid-century regional painters, the exact category Delacroix's work fell into. She came to the house herself rather than asking us to transport the painting anywhere, said she preferred, whenever possible, to examine a disputed piece in its original context first, before any handling or transport could complicate an already delicate assessment. She spent nearly 2 hours in front of that painting, examining it under different types of light, photographing specific sections at extreme close range, occasionally making small, quiet sounds of concentration that told me nothing definitive, but kept my stomach in a tight, anxious knot the entire time. When she finally sat down with my mother, my aunt, and me at the kitchen table to share her initial impressions, she was careful, appropriately cautious about drawing firm conclusions before more rigorous testing, but direct about what her trained eye was telling her. The brushwork technique, she said, was skilled, clearly the work of someone with genuine technical facility, but it diverged in several specific, consistent ways from documented, verified examples of Delacroix's authenticated work from museum collections and prior appraisal records. Subtle differences in how paint had been layered to build texture, in the particular rhythm of individual brushstrokes. Differences that a casual viewer would likely never notice, but that someone trained, specifically in this artist's documented technique, would eventually catch, the way she apparently had. I want to be careful not to overstate my confidence at this stage, Wilhelmina told us. What I'm describing could theoretically be explained by restoration work that altered the surface in unusual ways, though what you're describing to me about the timeline and the restorer's identity being unverifiable makes that explanation considerably less likely in my professional judgment. What I'd recommend, given the stakes involved, is a full technical analysis. Pigment composition testing, canvas and stretcher bar dating, infrared and X-ray imaging to examine underlying layers. If this painting is a forgery, even a skilled one, technical analysis at that level will almost certainly confirm it definitively, in a way that goes beyond stylistic impression alone. Those 6 weeks of waiting were their own strange, suspended kind of grief, layered on top of a year that had already asked more of our family's emotional endurance than any of us had expected to give. My Aunt Perpetua hosted a family dinner partway through that stretch, an ordinary, once-monthly gathering that had continued more or less on schedule since our grandfather's death, and Roderick attended, the way he always had, seemingly unaware that the rest of us were quietly waiting on laboratory results that might reveal exactly what he'd done. I remember sitting across from him at that dinner table, passing dishes, making small talk about nothing important, and feeling a specific disorienting vertigo I hadn't experienced before. The sensation of sharing a meal with someone while carrying a suspicion about them so serious it made every ordinary exchange feel like performance. My mother told me afterward that she'd felt the same thing, that she'd nearly said something to him twice that evening and stopped herself both times, not wanting to accuse him of anything before we actually had proof, not wanting to give him any warning that might let him further hide or destroy evidence if our suspicion turned out to be correct. The technical analysis took nearly 6 weeks to fully complete. Conducted through a regional conservation laboratory Wilhelmina had a long-standing professional relationship with, and I remember those 6 weeks as some of the longest of that entire year, checking my email obsessively, trying and mostly failing to maintain any normal rhythm to my daily life while waiting for results that would either confirm or, I kept hoping against increasingly diminishing hope, dispel what I already suspected in my gut. The results, when they finally came, were unambiguous in a way that left no real room for alternative explanation. The pigments used in several sections of the painting included synthetic compounds that hadn't been commercially available until decades after Delacroix's death, a detail that alone would have been sufficient to establish the painting as, at minimum, significantly altered from its original state, if not an outright wholesale forgery. The canvas itself, while genuinely old, showed stretcher bar construction techniques inconsistent with the documented manufacturing methods of the period Delacroix would have used, suggesting the canvas had likely been sourced from a different, later painting entirely, possibly deliberately chosen specifically because its age would pass a casual visual inspection. Infrared imaging revealed underlying sketchwork that bore no resemblance whatsoever to any documented preliminary studies or compositional choices associated with Delacroix's known working process, further undermining any possibility that this was simply an authentic painting altered through legitimate restoration. The painting hanging over what had been my grandfather's fireplace for the past 10 months was not, in any meaningful sense, the painting he had bought as a young man and treasured for 60 years. It was a skilled, deliberate forgery, produced by someone who understood Delacroix's style well enough to approximate it convincingly to an untrained eye, but who had made specific, ultimately detectable choices in materials and technique that gave the deception away under real scrutiny. Wilhelmina, once the technical results confirmed her initial impression, told us something that widened the scope of what we were dealing with considerably beyond a single, isolated act of family betrayal. She mentioned, carefully, that the specific quality and consistency of the forgery, skilled enough to convincingly approximate Delacroix's mature style, but with the particular telltale material anachronisms the lab had identified, reminded her of something she'd encountered once before, years earlier, in an entirely unrelated case involving a different regional painter's estate, a case she'd consulted on but hadn't personally been able to bring to a satisfying resolution at the time. She reached out, with our permission, to a colleague in the field, a provenance researcher named Basil Achterberg, who specialized in tracking the movement and history of artwork through estate transitions specifically, the kind of quiet, meticulous work that rarely made headlines, but occasionally uncovered exactly the kind of pattern we now suspected might exist. Basil, once briefed on the details of our case, told us something that made the whole situation suddenly feel much larger and much more calculated than a single desperate decision made under financial pressure. He remembered, from his own professional network, a case nearly 8 years earlier involving a different family's estate, a modest but genuinely valuable collection of regional landscape paintings left by a deceased collector to his 2 adult children. One of those children, Basil recalled, had handled the collection's insurance and storage logistics during the estate settlement process, had at one point suggested the paintings needed professional cleaning and conservation work, and had, some months later, returned the paintings to the family home, looking, according to the surviving siblings' later complaints, subtly different in ways she couldn't fully articulate at the time and hadn't had the resources or expertise to formally investigate. That sibling, a woman named Faustina Renner, had apparently raised concerns informally within her extended family and among a few art world acquaintances, but without the kind of resources Basil now understood we'd been fortunate enough to access: a trained appraiser willing to conduct a careful visual assessment, a conservation laboratory capable of full technical analysis. Her concerns had eventually faded into unresolved, unprovable suspicion, the kind of family rift that calcifies into permanent, silent estrangement without ever reaching a clear, documented conclusion either way. Basil helped us track down Faustina's contact information through old professional records, and I called her myself one evening, nervous in a way that felt strange, given that I'd never met the woman and had no real relationship to her beyond the strange, unfortunate coincidence Basil had surfaced. She was cautious at first, understandably wary of a stranger calling to ask about a painful, decade-old family dispute she'd mostly stopped discussing with anyone after years of getting nowhere. But once I explained the situation in detail, the forged Delacroix, the fabricated restorer, the technical analysis confirming material anachronisms, something in her tone shifted, the particular shift I was coming to recognize as the sound of someone finally, after years of doubting their own judgment, hearing confirmation that what they'd suspected all along had actually been real. I always believed the paintings that came back weren't quite right, Faustina told me. Everyone in my family told me I was imagining things, that grief was making me paranoid, that my brother had done nothing but a favor arranging the cleaning. I eventually stopped bringing it up because it was easier than being the person who sounded crazy at every holiday gathering, but I never actually stopped believing it. I just stopped saying it out loud. I asked her, carefully, whether her brother's name was one I might recognize, half expecting, half dreading some direct connection to Roderick himself. It wasn't. A different man entirely. No apparent relationship to my own family beyond. Basil eventually suggested, after some additional digging, a shared connection to the same regional restoration and framing community both men had apparently moved through over the years. A small, tightly networked professional world where, Basil noted grimly, someone skilled enough at producing convincing forgeries and confident enough to attempt this kind of deception once might easily have taught or been taught by someone else operating with a similar willingness to exploit exactly this kind of vulnerable moment in a grieving family's estate settlement. It's possible these are two entirely independent people who each separately decided to attempt something similar, Basil told us. It's also possible there's a connection between them we haven't identified yet, a shared restorer, a shared source for convincing forgery materials, even just a shared understanding, passed along through that professional community, of exactly how to exploit the specific window of confusion and reduce scrutiny that follows a family death. I can't tell you definitively which explanation is correct. What I can tell you is that Faustina's case, even 8 years old and never formally resolved, gives yours something extremely valuable. Independent, sworn corroboration that this specific method, offering to arrange restoration, then returning a subtly altered or entirely substituted painting, has been used successfully at least once before, against a family in circumstances almost identical to yours. With Wilhelmina's technical analysis, Basil's provenance research, and Faustina's sworn willingness to describe her own decade-old suspicion now formally documented, my mother, my aunt, and I brought everything to an estate litigation attorney specializing in art and cultural property disputes, a precise, formidable woman named Odalie Ferrand, who'd built much of her practice around exactly this uncomfortable intersection of family estate law and fine art authentication, a field, she told us, at our first meeting, was far more common a source of bitter, protracted family litigation than most people outside the art world ever realized. Odalie's first move was procedural but but critical. Formally notifying the estate's executor, a role my mother technically held jointly with her siblings under the will's original terms, that the painting currently in the estate's possession had been conclusively determined through independent technical analysis to be a forgery substituted for the original at some point during the estate settlement process, and that this substitution constituted a serious breach of fiduciary duty by whichever party had been responsible for it. This notification, sent formally and in writing, had the immediate practical effect of freezing any further estate distributions or the planned sale of the house until the matter could be properly investigated and resolved, a consequence that O'Daly noted would likely put considerable pressure on Roderick specifically, given what she'd learned through careful, discreet inquiry about his continuing financial difficulties in the years since our grandfather's death. O'Daly's second move was building out the case for exactly what had happened to the original painting, since establishing that a forgery now hung on the wall was only half the puzzle. The far more urgent question was locating the genuine Delacroix before it could be sold, hidden, or destroyed by someone increasingly desperate to avoid the consequences of what he'd apparently done. She brought in an investigator with experience specifically in stolen and diverted artwork, a methodical man named Grantham Pierce, who began by examining every financial and logistical detail of the window when Roderick had claimed the painting was out for restoration, bank records, any unusual transactions or new accounts opened during that period, any contact with galleries, auction houses, or private collectors who might plausibly have handled a piece of this significance and provenance. O'Daly brought Grantham into a preliminary meeting with all three of us before formally engaging him, explaining that investigations of this kind required careful, sometimes uncomfortable questions about a family member's private life, and wanted to make sure we all understood and consented to that scope before he began. Grantham himself was quiet, unhurried, the kind of person who seemed to absorb information rather than react to it, and he told us plainly, at that first meeting, that cases involving art fraud within families almost always came down to a traceable financial motive once you knew where to look, that his job was simply patience and paperwork, rather than anything more dramatic. However, the eventual findings might feel to the people who had to live with them. Grantham's investigation, conducted over roughly 5 weeks, uncovered a trail that Roderick had apparently believed was more thoroughly hidden than it actually was. A private sale, conducted through an intermediary broker rather than a public auction house, specifically to avoid the kind of provenance scrutiny a major auction house would have required, had moved the genuine Delacroix to a private collector roughly 9 months earlier for a sum considerably below the painting's true market value, but still substantial enough to explain, Grantham noted dryly, several of Roderick's outstanding debts that had quietly, mysteriously resolved themselves around. That same period, debts my mother and aunt had noticed but never fully understood the source of at the time. The private collector, once Grantham identified him through careful tracing of the broker's transaction records, turned out to be a genuinely unwitting party in the deception, a retired businessman with a long-standing, entirely legitimate interest in regional art who had purchased the painting believing the provenance documentation the broker provided was accurate and complete. O'Daly's approach with him was careful and collaborative rather than adversarial, since pursuing an innocent purchaser aggressively would likely have driven the painting further into hiding rather than closer to recovery. She explained the situation fully, provided him with Wilhelmina's technical analysis confirming the painting currently hanging in my grandfather's house was a forgery, and made clear that the genuine painting he now possessed was almost certainly stolen property, sold to him under false pretenses by a broker who had, whether knowingly or not, facilitated a fraud against a grieving family's estate. The collector, to his considerable credit, cooperated fully once he understood the situation, provided his own purchase documentation, and agreed to have his painting formally examined by Wilhelmina to confirm it was indeed the genuine original, rather than some third, entirely separate forgery. It was. The brushwork technique, the pigment composition, the canvas and stretcher bar construction all matched, documented, verified characteristics of Delacroix's authenticated work precisely, a conclusion Wilhelmina delivered with visible, genuine relief, having spent weeks worried that even the recovered painting might turn out to be yet another layer of deception in an increasingly complicated case. O'Daly's strategy, once the genuine painting's location and the collector's good faith innocence were both established, was to combine the full weight of everything we'd assembled, the technical forgery analysis, the financial trail Grantham had uncovered, Faustina's sworn corroboration of a prior similar incident, into a comprehensive demand directed at Roderick, laying out our intention to pursue both a formal breach of fiduciary duty claim within the estate proceeding and, separately, a referral to law enforcement regarding the apparent theft and fraudulent sale of estate property, unless he cooperated fully and immediately with recovering the situation. O'Daly spent the evening before the meeting with Roderick and his newly retained attorney, walking my mother and aunt through what to expect. The careful, methodical preparation I'd come to understand was standard practice among attorneys handling cases like this, as though every one of them had independently arrived at the same understanding of what a family needs psychologically before confronting the person who'd betrayed them this completely. She told us our role in the room wasn't to relitigate a lifetime of watching Roderick struggle financially, wasn't to make him feel the full full weight of what he'd done to our grandfather's memory in that moment. It was simply to let the documentation speak, to be present, composed, undeniably real, while the technical analysis and the financial trail and Faustina's sworn statement did the work none of us could do as convincingly through raw emotion alone. My mother asked, more than once in the days leading up to that meeting, whether she should simply call Roderick directly first, sibling to sibling, before involving attorneys formally in a confrontation that felt, to her, like it was moving further and further away from anything resembling a family conversation. O'Daly was gentle but firm in her advice against it. Everything you've told me about how he responded to your niece's early questions suggests he's someone who becomes more evasive, not less, the more directly and personally he's confronted, she said. A formal meeting, with full documentation on the table, removes his ability to manage the conversation through charm or guilt, the way he's clearly done successfully with your family in smaller moments up to this point. The meeting happened at O'Daly's office on a cold afternoon in early winter, almost exactly 1 year after our grandfather's death, a timing none of us had planned deliberately, but that felt, sitting in that conference room waiting for Roderick to arrive, weighted with a significance none of us could quite ignore. Roderick came in with his attorney, a younger man who looked, throughout most of the meeting, increasingly uncomfortable, as the full scope of the evidence became clear, the specific discomfort of someone realizing partway through a case that his client's version of events bears little resemblance to what actually happened. I hadn't seen Roderick in person since a family gathering nearly 6 months earlier, before any of this had come fully into focus, and I found myself watching him settle into his chair across the table, struck by how much thinner he looked, how much older, the particular toll of carrying a secret this large for the better part of a year, visible in ways that made some small, stubborn part of me feel a flicker of unwanted sympathy, even amid everything else I was feeling in that moment. O'Daly walked through the case methodically, the same careful, unhurried presentation I imagined she'd given dozens of times before in situations none of us would ever hear the details of. Wilhelmina's technical analysis confirming the painting currently in the estate's possession was a material and structural forgery. Grantham's financial trail, tracing the genuine painting's private sale 9 months earlier through an intermediary broker specifically to avoid provenance scrutiny, the innocent. Collectors' cooperative confirmation that the recovered painting matched every documented characteristic of Delacroix's authentic work, and finally delivered without particular emphasis, simply as one more piece of the growing record, Faustina Renner's sworn statement describing a strikingly similar pattern from 8 years earlier, involving a different family, a different painter, but the same essential method. I watched something shift in Roderick's expression at that final piece specifically, a flicker that looked, unmistakably, like genuine shock, and I understood, watching it, that whatever connection existed between his scheme and Faustina's brother's earlier one, a shared restorer, a shared criminal education passed quietly through some corner of the framing and conservation world neither of us fully understood. Roderick clearly hadn't expected that older, separate betrayal to ever resurface in a room concerning our own family's painting. His attorney tried early on to suggest that the technical anachronies Wilhelmina had identified might be explained by some legitimate, if unusual, restoration technique, and O'Daly responded calmly that she was fully prepared to have Wilhelmina and the Conservation Laboratory's own senior chemist testify to their findings in a formal proceeding if Roderick's side wished to contest the technical analysis directly, an offer that visibly deflated whatever remaining confidence his attorney had walked into the room with. It was Roderick himself, not his attorney, who finally spoke, in a voice that had lost almost all of the clipped, defensive edge he'd used with me on our earlier phone calls. He said he'd been drowning in debt in a way none of us had fully understood, that a series of bad decisions compounding over years had left him facing consequences he genuinely believed he had no other way out of, and that when he'd realized, going through our grandfather's estate, just how much the painting alone was worth, some desperate, cornered part of him had convinced himself that a careful, well-executed substitution was a victimless solution, that the rest of the family would keep the sentimental object we all cared about, technically unaware anything had changed. While he quietly solved a financial crisis he was too ashamed to ask any of us to help him with directly. He said, quieter now, that he'd told himself at the time, some version of the story where nobody would ever actually know, where the forgery was skilled enough that it would simply hang on that wall for the rest of all our lives, undetected, harming no one. I didn't think anyone would ever look closely enough to catch it, he said. I told myself that made it not really a betrayal. I don't know anymore whether I actually believed that, or just needed to believe it to be able to live with what I was doing. He didn't offer any explanation connecting himself to Faustina's brother's earlier scheme, didn't acknowledge any specific relationship to that older case beyond his visible shock at hearing it mentioned, and O'Daly didn't press him on it in that meeting, telling us afterward that establishing a direct connection between the two cases wasn't necessary to resolve our own, however much all of us remained curious about it. The settlement O'Daly negotiated over the following weeks required Roderick to formally forfeit his entire remaining share of the estate to cover, as fully as possible, the cost of recovering the genuine painting from the innocent collector, a negotiated buyback at a price that fairly compensated the collector for his own losses in the transaction, since he'd acted in complete good faith and shouldn't have had to bear any financial cost for a fraud he'd had no part in creating. It also required Roderick to cooperate fully with a formal, sworn accounting of the private sale, including identifying the intermediary broker who had facilitated it. Information Odalie made clear would likely be referred to law enforcement for separate investigation into the broker's own potential criminal liability in facilitating what amounted to the sale of stolen estate property, regardless of what path my mother and aunt ultimately chose regarding Roderick himself. That last decision, whether to pursue criminal charges against Roderick personally, beyond the civil settlement already negotiated, was the hardest conversation my mother, my aunt, and I had throughout the entire ordeal, harder in its own way than any of the investigation or confrontation that had come before it. We had that conversation 3 separate times over 2 weeks, each time circling the same territory without quite landing anywhere, each of us bringing a slightly different emotional weight to the table depending on the day. Perpetua, initially, wanted to push for full criminal prosecution, feeling that anything less would let Roderick escape genuine accountability for what amounted to theft and fraud against his own grieving family. He didn't just take money, she said, at one particularly raw dinner table conversation. He took Dad's actual physical memory off our wall and replaced it with a lie, and let us grieve in front of that lie for 10 months. I don't know how to just let that go without consequences that actually mean something. My mother felt differently, torn between genuine anger at what her brother had done and a lifetime of protective instinct toward a younger sibling she'd bailed out of trouble more times than either of us could count. She said more than once that she kept picturing Roderick in an actual jail cell and finding she couldn't hold that image steady in her mind without also picturing him as a small boy, years before any of us were born, the specific tenderness a much older sibling sometimes never fully outgrows. I found myself, through those difficult conversations, somewhere in between, understanding both positions completely while not fully able to commit to either one myself. We ultimately decided, after weeks of painful circling conversation, not to pursue criminal charges against Roderick directly, focusing instead on the civil recovery and the broker referral, a decision Odalie told us was entirely within our rights to make and one she'd seen plenty of families arrive at for reasons similar to ours, that the genuine goal, for most of the families she worked with in situations like this, was recovering what had been taken and preventing future harm, not necessarily extracting the maximum possible legal punishment from someone who was, whatever he'd done, still family. The collector himself, once the recovery was fully arranged, asked if he could meet the family before the painting officially changed hands again, a request Odalie relayed to us carefully, noting he seemed to genuinely want some closure of his own on a transaction that had turned out to be far more fraught than he'd ever imagined when he'd first fallen in love with the piece at what he'd believed was a legitimate private sale. We met him at Odalie's office, an older man named Ferris Callender, soft-spoken and visibly uncomfortable with how his good faith purchase had entangled him in someone else's family crisis. He told us he'd hung the painting in his study for the better part of a year, had spent quiet evenings genuinely appreciating it, had no idea, the entire time, that a family somewhere was grieving its absence in a way that went beyond mere financial loss. He apologized, unnecessarily but sincerely, for whatever role his purchase had played in prolonging our uncertainty, and my mother, to my surprise, reached over and thanked him instead for his cooperation, for believing us without demanding an unreasonable fight, for treating the painting, in his own way, with the same respect our grandfather always had. The genuine Delacroix came home 3 months after that settlement meeting, transported carefully by Wilhelmina herself, who insisted on personally supervising its return and reinstallation, given everything the painting had already been through. I remember standing in my grandfather's old living room, technically now mid-sale, the family finally moving forward with the house's transition to new owners, but not quite gone from us yet, watching Wilhelmina carefully unwrap the canvas and hang it back in its original place over the fireplace, the exact spot it had occupied for 60 years before 9 months of quiet, deliberate deception had briefly, almost successfully, erased it from our family entirely. My mother cried standing in front of it, the specific kind of crying that comes from relief arriving on top of grief that had never fully finished processing in the first place. She reached out and touched the lower left corner, the same section I'd first noticed looked wrong all those months earlier, and I watched her fingers trace, very lightly, the thick, deliberate brushwork our grandfather had once shown me himself, the genuine texture of paint layered by an artist's actual hand rather than a skilled forger's careful, ultimately detectable approximation. I drove to pick Faustina up from the train station myself the day she came to see the recovered painting, a 2-hour trip each way that gave us more time to talk than either of our earlier phone calls had allowed, and I remember being struck over the course of that drive by how much of her account of the past 8 years had settled into a kind of careful, practiced neutrality, the tone of someone who told a painful story so many times to people who didn't quite believe her that she'd learned to deliver it without much visible emotion left attached, purely as a way of protecting herself from having to feel it fresh each time. Faustina came to see the recovered painting a few weeks later, having asked, tentatively, whether it would be strange for her to visit given that her own case had never reached anything close to this kind of resolution. I told her it wouldn't be strange at all, that in some ways, without her willingness to finally say out loud what she'd suspected for 8 years, none of this recovery would have happened the way it did. She stood in front of the Delacroix for a long time when she finally saw it, quiet, and afterward told me that seeing our case resolve the way hers never had brought up a complicated mix of feelings she hadn't fully anticipated. Genuine happiness for our family, alongside a fresh, sharp grief for her own unresolved loss. A painting she still didn't know the current whereabouts of. A brother she hadn't spoken to in years. A betrayal that had simply calcified into permanent silence rather than ever finding its way to anything resembling justice or repair. I'm glad it worked out for you, she told me, standing in that living room. I mean that completely. But I won't pretend it doesn't also remind me of everything that didn't work out for me. I asked her, the way I imagine anyone in my position would eventually ask, whether she'd consider reopening her own case now, given that Basil's research had at least established a documented adjacent pattern that might strengthen whatever claim she still had standing to pursue after all these years. She told me she'd think about it, that she wasn't sure yet whether she had the emotional stamina for a fight that had already cost her nearly a decade of peace the first time she'd tried and failed to make anyone take her seriously. I told her, the same way Basil had once told us, that whatever she decided, the option was there now in a way it hadn't been before, and that I'd help however I could if she ever chose to pursue it. Roderick and I have spoken only once since that settlement meeting, a brief, strained phone call a few months later where he apologized again, more directly this time, without his attorney present to shape his language into something more legally careful. He told me he'd started seeing a financial counselor, was working through the debts that remained even after the settlement had absorbed the bulk of his estate share, was trying, in his words, to understand how a person convinces himself that stealing from his own grieving family constitutes a solution, rather than an entirely new kind of catastrophe. Near the end of the call, his voice caught briefly, and he asked whether I thought our grandfather would have ever forgiven him. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that it wasn't a question I felt equipped to answer on a dead man's behalf, and that maybe the more useful question was whether he could eventually find a way to forgive himself in a manner that didn't require pretending what he'd done was smaller than it actually was. I didn't have much else to say back to him in that call beyond acknowledging that I'd heard him, that I appreciated him at least attempting real accountability, rather than continuing to hide behind vague, defensive explanations. I don't know yet what our relationship will look like going forward, whether time will eventually soften this the way it seems to for some families and never quite manages to for others. I think often about the specific afternoon that started all of this, standing in front of that painting 10 months after my grandfather's death, noticing something wrong in the brushwork of a corner I remembered so specifically because he'd once shown it to me himself with real tenderness, explaining exactly how Delacroix had built up the paint to capture a particular quality of afternoon light. I think about how easily I could have talked myself out of that discomfort, the way I nearly did in the moment, the way Faustina, in her own case, eventually did after years of being told she was imagining things. I think about how much of what actually got recovered here depended on a series of small, specific decisions to trust a nagging feeling rather than dismiss it. Mine, initially, then my aunt's willingness to admit she'd noticed something too, then Wilhelmina's professional rigor, then Basil's willingness to make an unlikely connection across two unrelated cases, separated by 8 years and no obvious link beyond a shared, ugly method. I keep a folder now, the way I've come to understand people in situations like mine so often eventually do, with Wilhelmina's full technical report, Grantham's financial trail documentation, Faustina's sworn statement, and the final settlement, tucked into a box among the other belongings I took from my grandfather's house before it finally sold to a young family who, I'm told, have no idea what a small, ordinary-looking room over what used to be a fireplace, once nearly lost, and then, against considerable odds, actually recovered. I don't open that folder often, but I want it there, the whole record, for the day I have children of my own, old enough to stand in front of whatever wall the Delacroix eventually hangs on. Since my mother, once the house sold, asked me to take on its custody first, in the rotating arrangement our grandfather's will always specified, an arrangement none of us had ever actually needed to formalize until now, and ask me why a corner of that painting looks, if you know exactly where and how to look, the tiniest bit different from a photograph taken before any of this happened, a difference so small it would mean nothing at all to anyone except the family that spent a year learning exactly how much a single detectable inch of brushwork can matter.